Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about theories of development. Now, you guys probably get a lot of this in all of your classes, and you're probably wondering why do we cover this in every class? And again, it's so that we can drill it into your head so that you have a paradigm from which to study people, to make sense of their world and who they are. All right, so let's get into it. So for this class, we're in developmental psychology, the second level. So we're going to be looking at theories that we can apply towards development to account for how do people grow over time. And for this class, we're really going to be looking at specifically childhood up to adolescence. Okay. So we want theories to give us, a paradigm from which to approach the world, some sense of hypotheses about what's happening, help generate discoveries, and offer some practical guidance as we try to make sense of people and how they grow. Okay. So we're going to learn about what's practical about a theory, how do childhood experiences affect adults, would you be a different person if you grew up in another place or century? And why do we need to know so many theories? All right. So the first one we're going to delve into is psychodynamic theory, and this is often accounted to Freud and others that are involved in psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory. It used to be called psychoanalytic theory, but in modern times, to kind of get away from all the whole sexual psycho stuff, they've introduced psychodynamic theory. When I'm thinking about psychodynamic theory, what I really care about is the unconscious processes. How do unconscious processes drive us? Okay. You might ask the question, are we conscious all the time when we're awake, for example? The answer is no. You are often not conscious. Your unconscious mind is always doing most of the work. And then when it wants your consciousness to think about something, it'll send you some signals, and all of a sudden you become aware and you start to think about things. This is kind of how it is like with hunger. Your body releases hormones into your bloodstream, which travel and seep into the gray matter of your brain. Your unconscious mind interprets these hormones, these signals, these chemical receptors, and then it sends a signal to your conscious mind that you should get in the car and drive to the grocery store and go get some food. Okay. You have to ask yourself, you know, how much of your unconscious mind is driving your behavior? And so when we're thinking about Freud, that's the questions that we're asking. We're asking, how much does the unconscious mind drive our behavior? Look at kids, look at children, look at adolescents. How fully conscious and aware and developed are they at this point? So much of what they're doing is just unconscious processes spewing out the desire for play, the desire for food, the desire for comfort. They're just constantly seeking out because their unconscious mind has these impulses, so these neural processes that are driving them to seek out social things, seek out warmth and comfort, seek out food, seek out water. Okay. This is all part of what it's to be a human. We are driven to learn language and use words. These are unconscious processes in the beginning. Yes, as you get older, you might start thinking about it, but think about kids. Are they really thinking, or are they just kind of acting and behaving so much based upon these unconscious processes? Now, Freud, you always study these stages, and I'm again always going to be very critical of all stages that we get into. But for Freud, just to cover it, he says that we go through these stages as we develop. The oral stage, where we're obsessed with things in our mouth, the anal stage, in the penis or the phallic stages where we start getting introduced to our body. And then, we get into puberty. And then again, so again, I'm not a huge fan of all of this. I mean, basically, do all of us have these impulses? I don't know. It's just something to think about. So for Freud, what I'm really focused on is the unconscious processes and whether we have these psychosocial motivations, these oral motivations, you guys can work that out on your own. But for psychodynamic theory, again, just think about the unconscious mind. How is that motivating us? When you're riding a bike, are you really thinking about it? Are you thinking about moving your leg, each one in circles, or does your body just do it for you? Same thing when you're driving a car, you don't really think about it. It becomes an unconscious process once you learn how to do it. You only really think about driving when there's things that you have to think about on the road. The rest of the time, it's unconscious. That's why you shouldn't use your text, when you're driving, because the second you start looking at your phone, your brain actually forgets that it's driving. And so then those processes get put into your phone instead of the road. And that's why you can't actually drive straight. So Freud, unconscious theories. When it comes to Erikson, same thing here. Erikson is a stage theory, arguing that we all go through these stages as we grow and develop. And if we don't master that stage, then our development gets stunted. And again, you have to ask, is that really accurate? Right? Like all of us are going to struggle with our identity. We're all going to struggle with guilt, isolation, stagnation, mistrust, despair. We're going to deal with that our whole lives. It's not like something we just get over. We're all going to have inferiority complexes. Look at my hair. I am constantly like, I'm balding. Do I need to shave it to hide it? Should I grow it out long to hide it? I'm stuck in the 6 to 11 years of industry versus inferiority, like, I mean, just because of my hair, it might sound silly. But with Erikson, the idea is we slowly grow through these stages. And so first it's trust versus mistrust. Do you trust your parents or do you not? Are you scared to go out on your own or are you not? Which leads you into autonomy versus shame or doubt. You're either comfortable going off from your parents or you're super scared and you have to stay next to your parents all the time, for example. When it gets into initiative to guilt, 3 to 6, people start taking on the roles of the other, dressing up like a person, like a police person or a fire person. How do they feel when they're in these roles? Do they feel like they can meet those expectations or not? 6 to 11, children are busy practicing and learning skills and trying to become whatever person they're going to become. And how good are they at that stage? Then you get into adolescence of identity and role confusion, of establishing who we are as people and trying to figure it out. But my whole argument is this pretty much goes on forever. We all have our comfort zones. A lot of us, once we get married, we're like scared to leave the couch and be away from our significant other, like, oh God, can't go in the world without them. I'm codependent. Can't go golfing by myself. Can't go eat by myself. I mean, do you guys not experience senses of inferiority complexes? I mean, we're college students, right? When you're a college student, it's not like you've like taken the role of a senator and you're super confident about your ability to be a CEO. You're learning what it's going to be like to take on those roles, and you don't even know if you can do that, and you probably won't even know until you're like 40. So is this really solved by the time you're like 6 to 11? We've got it all figured out. I'm so confident in my ability to take the role of anyone in the world. Again, these are ongoing processes, but you can say that, there are some universal maybe stages, right? Like at first you learn to walk, then you learn to talk, then you learn to interact with other people. Then you start to incorporate all this cultural knowledge, which leads to skill development, your education, causes your brain to grow and the cognitive processes to grow even more. Your sense of identity evolves as you categorize yourself and label yourself and set parameters and boundaries to who you are as a person. So to me, this is an ongoing thing. It's not like something that kids solve right away. But back in the day, they tried to come up with these theories that accounted for these stages that children have to go to become fully functional, contributing adults. And again, the argument is it's not that simple. So yes, Freud has his stages and Erikson has his stages, and there's some comparisons here between the two. But ask yourself, how relevant are these? But the ideas are cool. Right. So that's kind of what we're taking, even though some of that psychosexual oral phallic stage could definitely be discredited with Freud. The ideas of the unconscious processes are very powerful. And especially when you start getting into neuroscience and the structure of the brain and how everything functions, it's very cool and complicated stuff. And then with Erikson, this idea that we grow through these stages and that we have to overcome these barriers to become self-actualized people, which is an Erikson, that's later psychology. But again, that's kind of the idea, right? How do we grow and become, functioning adults? We have to go through these stages, overcome our inferiority, overcome our role confusion, overcome our sense of isolation, overcome our laziness. Basically, it sounds like we're overcoming the 7 deadly sins or something. I don't know. And so, but who knows where Erikson picked this up. But for psychosocial theory, Erikson's theory of the stages of development emphasizes interaction between the psychic needs of the individual and the surrounding community. There are 8 stages, according to Erikson, that are described by a particular challenge or crisis that we have to go through to develop. And he says these unresolved conflicts last throughout our life. And I'm basically saying, no one ever resolves this stuff, right? You guys are always going to have this sense of guilt, shame, doubt, mistrust in others. That's just something we're always having to overcome. That's part of being human. All right. So for behaviorism, we'll start to get into the learning theory. So we're going to do classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then we'll get into social learning theories. For behaviorism, you're always thinking stimulus response. I put my hand on a hot stove. I learned that's hot. Don't touch it again. I have the association between that stove being hot and me getting burned. So that's always the idea of stimulus response. You know, you get stimulated by something, you respond to it, and then you have an association between the stimuli and the response. The stimuli is the heat. My response is me getting burnt. I now have an association that heat equals being burnt. You hear the sound of a train. Your parents keep saying, train, train. You hear the sound of a train. Your parents say, train, train. Eventually, you associate that sound with a train, or at least the sound of a train, until you're old enough to know that the sound of a train means this and it looks like this, okay? And so again, your parents, by always repeating these words and pointing at stuff and saying these words, and you hear a sound and they point and they say, that's it. That's how kids learn the language. They learn the association between the sound of a train and what that sound actually is through the repetition, either from seeing the train or from your parents just saying train and you learning that that sound means train. So again, behaviorism, that's the idea, stimulus and response. It's also called classical conditioning. The idea is we become conditioned. We learn that heat equals getting burnt. Be careful. Sound of train equals there's a train somewhere. Okay? That's just stimulus response that leads to an association, us learning there's a link between that sound and that automobile or that heat and me getting burnt, okay? Classical reconditioning, they always get into Pavlov's dog. If you ring a bell and then give the dog the food, it get used to that every time it hears the bell to expect food, it starts to salivate. With my birds outside, I whistle the same song twice every time I go to feed them. My goal is that whenever they hear the sound of me whistling, they know that it's time for food, and then all the cardinals will come and hang out. Okay? All right. Operant conditioning takes this a little bit further. Operant conditioning focuses on rewards and punishments after the stimuli and responses that lead us to certain behaviors, right? So if I hear a bell and then I get a steak, that's classical conditioning. But if I go do something good and then I get a steak, operant conditioning. So if I make a dog sit and it sits and I give it a steak, I'm giving it a reward. If I ask a dog to sit and it doesn't sit, and then I like push it to the ground or I do something as a form of punishment, that's punishment. Okay. Both of those involve types of stimuli. So you have positive reinforcement, which are positive rewards, which means giving a stimuli to get a certain behavior that you want. Negative reinforcement involves taking a stimuli away to get what you want. So whenever you're thinking about positive reinforcement, how do I bribe my kids to pick up their room, right? Kids, you pick up your room, I'll get you a cookie. Positive reinforcement, okay? Negative reinforcement, I always think about an alarm clock, right? Like let's say you want to sleep in, okay? So you turn off the alarm clock, you remove the stimuli, which then reinforces I get to sleep more types of behavior. And then punishment is when you use a negative sanction of some form, some type of stimuli that's a negative sanction, and you impose that. And what we found is that reinforcement, both positive and negative, tends to get the desired behaviors you want more so than punishment, because when kids are punished, for example, they simply learn an alternative method to get what they want while avoiding punishment. Social learning theory is definitely one of my favorites. And this is the idea that we learn through observation. Birds do this. Birds will come into life, they will listen to other bird calls, and then they will form their own bird call, right? But they take in other information. They observe from society, And then they cognitively reflect upon that, whether it's unconscious or conscious, and then you make decisions. Then you decide what you want to do. Okay. So social learning is simply learning through observation. Watch what others do. You incorporate that knowledge into your schematic knowledge in your brain, and then so on and so forth. Our personality develops a lot in this way. We look to other people. We see, how are they acting? How are they behaving? How do they respond to these situations? What makes them cool? And then we mimic, we imitate that behavior, or it becomes our own, right? And so again, by watching other people, we observe and think, how are they acting? How can I be like them? Okay. So social learning emphasizes that the influence that other people have over a person's behavior. Again, this means that social people in society, we call them agents of socialization. They are constantly socializing us, and we are constantly observing other people to decide how to behave and act, right? All right. So we learn through observation and imitation. Okay. Modeling is the process by which we observe a person and then we act like them. So think about when you're kids, you model police officers, you put on the outfit, you act like them. You see your dad making a cake, you want in, you go make a cake. You know what I mean? You see the way your parents dress, you start to dress like them. You look at your siblings and you're like, what are they doing? You start to act like them. Okay. So social learning is simply observing, incorporating that information, and then going from there. Cognitive theory, this is when we start to get into the structure of the brain, okay, which is neuroscience. But again, to get really into cognitive theory, it's a thinking science. Cognitive theory is all about how do we think? Okay, but to understand how we think, we have to understand neuroscience. We have to understand how the structure of the brain, how the brain operates. And it's often compared to a computer. Like you have these schemas of knowledge, which are your memories, right? And then you could access your memories to get around in the world. And the more you experience, the more you grow, the more you think, the more schematic knowledge you have, the easier it should be to get around in the world, right? So cognitive theory is really just thinking, is a theory about how do people think. But to understand how people think, you have to understand the biology of the brain, the actual cognitive processes of thinking, and then the social context and how that influences the way you think, okay? Because the way you think is highly influenced by what you've been taught by others in the world, your experiences, your ideologies, your race, your gender. All of these things structure you because if you're a girl, are you taught to think the same way as a boy? If you're Black, are you taught to think the same way as someone is Asian? Or are there slightly different approaches to life? Again, something like language can actually change the map of our brain. So if you take someone from China and someone from Germany and you have them do 1+1 and then you put some measures on their brain, they don't really match up. But if you take two Germans and have them do 1+1, their brains match up, like where the activity is in their brain matches up, because language itself structures the map of our brain, the physical brain. Again, it's much more complex neuroscience than we got to get into today, but it's important for developmental psychology to understand how our culture, what we're exposed to, how much we're challenged, the type of education we receive, all influence just not only the structure of our brain, but how much our brain can grow. Okay. So with Piaget, again, we also introduced some of these theories about how we grow over time in stages cognitively, the actual structure of our brain, right? At what point does consciousness kick in? At what point does self-awareness kick in? At what point does the theory of the mind, whereas we can put ourselves in somebody else's head and kind of see ourselves through their eyes, at what point does this happen? And so for Piaget, you're going to have sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and former. And again, just think about it as basic stages. Sensory motor is those early stages where you don't really have the language yet, but you're starting to move your body. Then you get into the pre-operational stages where you learn the mastery of language and how to use the mechanics of your body. Then you get into concrete operational, which is like, once you hit like 11 years old, those kids are smart, doing algebra, geometry, but yet they're still not as objective. I can't necessarily think outside the box just yet. That really takes us into the formal operational stages where you can just step outside your head, think outside the box, That's kind of the overall development. But again, it's like, how do you develop wisdom over the time? Wisdom grows in the same way. The more you use your brain and your body and have experiences in the world and reflect and think about it and update your knowledge over time, your fluid and crystallized knowledge just continues to grow. Your ability to learn, yes, may naturally cap out biologically, just like it's harder to learn languages at a certain point. But again, we could still be constantly growing our crystallized knowledge over time. All right. So again, it breaks it down to sensory motor. Infants think via their senses. Then you get into pre-operational. Preschoolers have language, but not great logic. Then you get into concrete operational, where they have simple logic. And then you get into formal operational of adolescence and adulthood, where they can use this formal and abstract knowledge. But think about it. I mean, when do adolescents really grow this ability? I'm going with at least 25, because that's still when our free prefrontal cortex is growing. Okay. But yes, there are things with cognitive theory, like applying it to a computer, or this information processing theory, looking at the human thinking kind of like a computer and the way it analyzes data with inputs and outputs and memory storage. And, take what you will of that. And here are some charts that are pulled from your book just to compare, okay, the different types of conditioning: classical and operant conditioning, social learning. And then you have Piaget's stages broken out for you guys here. So if you need something a little more specific for your assignment, just check into that. Sociocultural theory is absolutely fascinating. I'm always talking about Vygotsky. What I usually take from this is, how do you make a kid a rocket scientist? Kids aren't naturally just going to become rocket scientists. It takes a lot of social investment. You have to put those kids into school, they're not cram, because cramming is bad. Study frequently, all the time. There you go. To get that knowledge into those kids' brains so they can do advanced mathematics, advanced engineering. Okay. That takes a ton of work. And so sociocultural theory is that agents of socialization invest in you. The more society invests in you, the more your physical brain grows. And the more your physical brain grows, your ability to do more complex mathematics, geometry, music, art, whatever it is, all your types of intelligences, social skills, body skills, these come with practice. You want to be an NBA basketball player? Tens and hundreds of thousands of free throws. And you know what happens to NBA basketball players? Their neural pathways become super efficient in their brain, right? That's what happens. The more you grow, the more you learn, just your tree of knowledge becomes faster and faster, like a super fast highway. So imagine taking a road trip by the back roads or by the interstates. The more you grow, it's like taking a road trip by the interstates. But if you don't grow a lot, it takes longer. The processes aren't as fast. So again, the more you teach children, the more you drill stuff into their head, the more growth and development physically they will, experience. And this is a hard lecture too, because you have to ask, who ends up smarter? Who ends up with a more developed brain? Kids who go to good schools, or kids who go to not so good schools where the social investment isn't very high? And again, what you find is there is serious inequality there. Okay. Kids who go to better schools tend to get more sociocultural input, which enables their brain to grow more. Okay. Again, we are, so I put a ton of words on here. So again, I'm just trying to break it down for you, but at any time, if you guys need to pause and read through all of this, definitely do that. I put this in here in case you guys just need like some extras fluff out for your theories. Evolutionary psychological theory is one of my favorites. It asks, how do we develop over time, over millennia? How have these human behaviors, that which makes us human, when did the third layer of our brain, the outer cortex, really grow? It's more recent. Okay. So again, you have your hindbrain and the midbrain, the breathing and heartbeat. That's the first part of our brain that grew. Then your limbic system grew, which is all your emotional centers and things along those lines. And then over time, the outer part of our brain grew, and that's where we can do the complex math and reading and art, and all of that comes from our later evolved thing. But our behavior, the way we act, is highly influenced by our DNA, our genetics, our unconscious processes. And this can create a huge fight, but a lot of it is kind of determined, like your ability to hear within a range of hertz, your ability to see within a range of wavelengths. That's limited. You can't see all light, you can't hear all sound, right? Dogs can hear sounds that we can't because our basic biology limit us or enables us in these specific ways. Okay. Our fear of snakes, for example, it is in our DNA. It's kind of weird to think about. How does your DNA know to be scared of snakes? But that's a cool question. You got to ask that question. But our DNA is not afraid of alcohol. Like pregnant women aren't scared of alcohol. They don't necessarily get the sickness when they have alcohol. And that's because alcohol is a new recent invention, and our DNA hasn't actually learned that alcohol is bad. And so it's a really cool discussion. I heard that lecture from a psychology lecture from Yale when I was first teaching psychology. He was talking about that. Like, why do we get sickness if you're pregnant from some foods, but not from things like alcohol? But that's the argument, is that your DNA hasn't caught up enough. And it's kind of interesting to think how, like, does your DNA have knowledge? But again, that's the idea. So, how have our bodies and brains evolved over time? And now that we've evolved into whatever we are, how does what we are influence our behavior? Again, we're all driven to be social. We're driven to go out and find sex and shelter and warmth. Okay. And so, how does that influence our behavior? That's the overall question. All right. All right. So again, to recap, psychoanalytic theory, unconscious mind processes. How does that drive our behavior? Behaviorism, we learn through stimuli and response. You step on something sharp, you learn don't step on sharp stuff, it hurts my foot. You developed an association. Cognitive theory, how do we think? Not just the structure of the brain, but how does our individual brain think? And then how has society influenced the way we think? Sociocultural theory, again, as society invests in you, you develop and grow faster. If you don't interact with a kid, they become feral, right? There comes a point where they can't even learn language. It's that bad. So again, the reason you can sit here and learn and watch this video, etc., is because someone invested in you and helped you grow into the person that you are. And then evolutionary theory, again, how are these basic drives, motivations, behaviors evolved over millions of years? And now that we've evolved into whatever we are, how does that motivate or drive our behavior? Okay. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. And then again, to apply the theories, you usually need a ton of theories. The thing is, no one theory is ever going to account for stuff. Like when I'm teaching this class, I'm going from a historical, biopsychosocial, philosophical approach, right? I need biology, I need psychology, sociology, and history to make sense of anything. And then I need the philosophy to kind of structure my theoretical or paradigm in which I'm approaching everything. Okay. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll end this at some point.